the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider joining the Patreon for $1 a month. Taylor's leading some reading groups there, and we've been posting those recordings to the Patreon, and there's some other side benefits. You get automatic invitation to our Discord server where the discussions are going on. But today, Taylor and I are very pleased to welcome back for the third time Eugene Holland. Eugene is Professor Emeritus at the Ohio State University in the Comparative Studies program. And we're just happy to have you back, Eugene, to discuss some markets, axiomatics, and just a hearty machinic welcome to you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Eugene, it's great to have you back. And I actually talked to I suppose a colleague of yours. I say suppose, but I had assumed when I reached out to him. I was talking to Charles Duvall earlier this week.
Oh,
And I mentioned we were having you back on the show, and you were publishing your collection of essays, and he got excited about that. He said, that's a good idea. I should do something like that. So he said hello and wished you well. And I actually got Charles to download and install and use Discord. So it's I've gotten him on Discord this was last year, to join an anti-Oedipus reading group. It was kind of nice of him to do that. So he sometimes reaches out to me on Discord and sends me a random message. He's working on the Deleuze seminars, obviously, but since they've been published in book form in French, they're going to start coming out in English. So he's remaining a busy guy. I've twisted his arm about some translation choices, only a couple, but I just wanted to let you know that he was. Maybe we'll see a Charles Duvall collection now. Maybe you'll start a trend where.
Well, that would be great. I'll get in touch with him because that sounds like a great idea. Now, is he involved with translating the seminars?
So I think that basically, the way it's interesting, right? That seminar project, which is great, and I recommend everybody that's interested in Deleuze to check out the Deleuze seminars over at Purdue, their website.
Mm-hmm.
And so originally these translations were done by a host of people, including Charles. I don't think Dan necessarily did any, although he's on the maybe the more I say difficult side. He's the one reaching out and trying to get grants and keep the funding and the website going and all of that. So he's almost the technical side, even though we know he can translate. But I know that Charles has translated, and I think that Timothy Murphy has translated some. I'm failing on a couple of other names, but a handful of other translators. And so now I think that he's gone back in, and with the new editions of the seminars coming out in book form in French, edited by David Lapouchade.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole new editorial apparatus behind the seminars now, and the transcripts are slightly different because of that work. And so Charles is going back not just through the French printed edition with Lapouchade's editorial movements and So he's got to tweak all of the translation. So he is like the overcoding translator
Oh,
of the. So if he didn't originally do whichever session, he's now got to take responsibility for the benefits and the downfalls of that work. But I do think it's good to have those coming out in book form
yes.
and
Hmm.
to be quote unquote official. With the stamp of approval from Poof and all of that. But
Yeah. Now, have you seen Lapoujade's editorials material in the French?
I haven't looked at it personally. I read Charles, and he'll share this with you. He kind of writes a preface to right now. The first one to come out is the seminars on painting. So it's not chronologically being done in
Ah,
French because this is
mhm.
like in 82 or 83. And Poop, if you remember, we had Dan and Charles on to talk about this last year, but he does write a few paragraphs about the interventions that David or David makes, and even the fact that in some places the transcripts are improved because of, I suppose, certain auditory technology that they were able
Oh,
to parse some of the inaudible, um, missing links, which I
right.
think is
Hmm.
great. But I do think that it meant that everything had to be overhauled to a certain extent, not like word by word, but the everything had to be scrutinized. And
Hmm.
and in any case, I do think that that's exciting that he's doing that work and carrying that on, just in case whether or not the Deleuze Seminars website loses funding
Ah, yes,
or
yes.
somehow goes in abeyance. Those can now hopefully be uh, put into a more permanent place.
Uh-huh.
I'm not trying to put bad thoughts out into the world, but you never know with these things. They've been luckily keeping it funded for the past decade or so, but you never know with
Hmm.
the state
Yeah.
of humanities grants these days. And in any case, I think he was jealous that you're putting out, and maybe you could say a few words, Eugene, if you will, about this collection you're putting out, and then circle back around, as I said, to give us a slice of life from your becoming scholar days. Maybe there's a moment that really crystallizes your growth and development that you can share with us this time around.
Well, the collection has been an interesting exercise because I've included essays from just about every decade in my career, and I parallel the evolution of my thinking about these topics with the evolution of Deleuze and Guattari's thought. So
Mm-hmm.
I actually start out explaining how I came to Deleuze and Guattari in the first place, and then end up in the conclusion reviewing how my thought has changed, how Deleuze and Guattari's thought has changed, and where the best prospects lie, I think now, for rescuing the market from capital. So it's been an interesting exercise to review this and to pick essays that make sense and put into place the pieces I need to make the argument I end up making. Um, I think I fell into Deleuze and Guattari studies in a way because Fred Jameson assigned Anti-Oedipus to a seminar of his I was taking, and it was at the time when he was about to write an essay about hermeneutics, and he used the schema, the genealogical schema from Anti-Oedipus as a framework for his own discussion of hermeneutics. But for me and a few other, maybe a half dozen other graduate students, it was both exhilarating and baffling. And so we formed a reading group and spent the next set of months trying to figure out what was going on in that in that work. So that was the first my first exposure to Deleuze and Guattari, and
Now that would have been in the 80s. You remember which year? I'm just curious
that
if you
would
had
that would have
the
been probably 76 or 77, maybe.
so before the English translation came out. Is
Yes,
that
yes.
okay? Gotcha.
We read it in French. The seminar was a complete seminar, but some of the material was in original languages. Um, And so, based on that exposure, well, I was about to say that I had studied quite a bit of Marx in college and went to UC San Diego to work with Fred Jameson for that reason, but was always both intrigued and put off by psychoanalysis. And so schizoanalysis was just perfect for me.
Okay, I see.
I had also been, for a semester or maybe two in college, I'd been an economics major. And
Oh,
so I abandoned that fairly quickly.
but hence your interest in markets, as you said, right?
Yes, and my having read Bataille was part of that lineage, I guess, and so um, the combination of Bataille and Nietzsche and interest but skepticism towards psychoanalysis and a good acquaintance with Marx made it is sort of a perfect book for me. And so surprisingly enough, ended up writing a dissertation on a lyric poet, whereas almost all of my studies, especially with Jameson, had been narrative
Mm.
studies. So, but the amazing thing about the Anti-Oedipus, and that's just about, well, that's an exaggeration, but I was about to say it was the only thing I'd read of theirs, but that's not true. I had read other Deleuze. But the concept of decoding combined with the psychoanalytic reading of Baudelaire that Walter Benjamin had already done, enabled me to use the schizoanalytic framework to study Baudelaire's poetry and his life and his essays and so forth in a way that linked it directly to the impact of the market on mid 19th century France. So that was really the germination of this, the assignment of the Anti-Oedipus, and then my finding in it tools, well, combined with Jakobson and structural linguistics. I mean, not just the book, not just Anti-Oedipus alone, but it
Right.
provided a framework that enabled me to do a study of Baudelaire, a narratological study of Baudelaire, and the evolution of his thought across two or three poetry collections that situated that evolution in the context of mid 19th century France and the impact of the market.
Now, is that piece you shared with us on Baudelaire, is that I believe is that going to be the first piece in your collection? Is it chronologically sort of developing?
That's a good question. It's part chronological and part methodological. Part
Okay.
one is all tools,
Gotcha.
and so you get the essay on Deleuze and Marx.
Yes.
And culminating, I think, in the essay on minor Marxism, which is what I tag for their version of Marxism. So the tools is the first four essays, first section, and they are arranged roughly chronologically. The second part is diagnoses. That's where the Baudelaire essay starts, that section. And then I go on to talk about Sartre, and then about Nizan, and then about fascism. So those are the diagnostic essays. And the last section is prospects.
There you go.
By that time, I had left literary criticism well behind me. It's funny to go back and look at the book on Baudelaire because although that was de rigueur for literary studies, it's just mind-boggling to have gotten into the weeds, I guess you'd say, about looking at the grammatical structure of this line as opposed to that line and so on.
Well, but as you said, you do link it to movements, and like you said, I mean, obviously having that background in Marx and Jameson as an advisor, it makes sense that you're not just doing that in isolation, right?
No.
It sounded like you were doing this in a broader reading in tandem with a historicist type of framework. Okay,
absolutely right. Yes, and in fact, Jameson's motto, "Always historicize," has been something I've subscribed to right along. Although, as I say, I think somewhere maybe in the introduction to this collection, when when Deleuze and Guattari historicize, they're really doing genealogy,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
not the kind of linear dialectical version of history that Jameson is intending when he says always historicize. But it's still a good, even if you have a different conception of history, which they do, it's still a very useful one, and it's a motto that I subscribe to. In fact, it's I think the next to last essay, or no, one of the essays in part 3 has always historicized as its motto. Epigram.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. See, I appreciate that, because I do think if you didn't say that in the last episode or the first one we had with you, that's a phrase, Coop, we've had. I believe you said it, Eugene, but we've definitely had another scholar to say something like that, right? And I do think that it's interesting reading your work for the collection, how you emphasize the shift from, because you mentioned the question about the linear history, how even if Anti-Oedipus is obviously doing this very particular type of historicization, which is critical, ironic, etc. Right? From if universal history, a la Marx, is to be taken seriously, it has to be self-critical and ironic. And but you do show, and I thought I hadn't appreciated this, I don't think, until you pointed it out, that even their notion of historicizing shifts from between the two volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia. And you really hit home on how A Thousand Plateaus, not just in the form of the book, in the dates attached to each plateau, but in its manner of looking at regimes of signs, for example, in Plateau 5, or obviously in the later plateaus on nomadology, on apparatus of capture, that even there they they multiply, if you will, they rhizomize their historical outlook from between the two volumes.
Yes. And in fact, I was thinking about, in order to emphasize their view of history, I was going to write something in this collection about how sadism and masochism need to be considered events.
Interesting.
And the logic of this is that if, according to transcendental empiricism, if everything amounts to the conditions from which it emerges, then sadism is the event of the consolidation of a set of factors that made capitalist production possible. And then subsequently, masochism is the consolidation of a set of institutions and practices that make capitalist consumerism possible. So this idea, I think I'm very taken with this idea. This, for me, a different way of understanding what they mean by events, and why the plateaus are dated in the Thousand Plateaus are dated the way they are. This is a moment of emergence of a phenomenon, and that's what the phenomenon is. It's conditions of emergence. So I didn't end up writing that, but it's a way of dramatizing how far from sexology I've taken these terms, and how they actually resonate with, not just with Deleuze's and then eventually Deleuze and Guattari's retake on psychoanalysis, but also how they think about doing historical work that's not linear, that's not dialectical, and so on.
As an aside, because I know, Coop, you had some really good questions and points in the doc, and that we can turn to specifically on jurisprudence, which Eugene alluded to, I think, before we started recording, this turn to legal axiomatics.
Right.
But I did want to point out, Eugene, something I found out in the past month or so, and I maybe should have already known, was that it seems as though, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the first piece by Deleuze translated into English, I believe, is his presentation on Masoch, right?
Oh.
What became later just titled Coldness and Cruelty. The Zone Books version dates from what, 89, 90, but the original translation, I believe, is from 71.
Oh,
Um, uh, maybe 73. I have to look at it again. I was telling Charles about this because I was wondering if he knew, but I was wondering if you were aware that the original translation of the quote unquote, I think that's the original French title, right? The presentation
that's
of
right.
Sacre Masoch. I
Yep.
believe that might be the earliest translation of Deleuze, and it tells us something about it's kind of interesting. You might think maybe Proust and Signs, at least the first edition. Obviously, it got reworked two
Yeah.
extra times, but in '64, or maybe the Nietzsche book might have been translated first. But no, it seems to be the what we now call coldness and cruelty.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting little historical tidbit.
It is, and I hope. Well, yeah. I do, in my conclusion to the collection, review Deleuze's thought about law, and I use the publication order of the original French to make an argument about how the evolution unfolds. So happily, the early translation doesn't mess that up for me. But I was not aware that that was the first translation. It'd be interesting if we and Charles can get a handle on it to make sure that's the case.
It might be interesting. It's possible that there's an essay by him that was translated earlier, but in terms of books, most of them don't come out until don't start coming out until the 80s, right?
80s,
And then
yeah,
yeah, so
right.
so the fact that that's all the way back to 71 tells us something about whether it be the interest in Sade, or maybe the interest in this work specifically less as quote unquote philosophy and more as a literary study, although we know it has diagnostic clinical functions and therefore relates to his conception of philosophy and Nietzschean philosophy as being a part of genealogy, symptomatology, etc. Right?
Right.
So I think that's just an interesting question of what was it? Was it the literary aspect, and then we get philosophy kind of slid underneath, like a Trojan horse in coldness and cruelty, without realizing it, right? So, but in any case, this question about law is important, and Coop, I really liked you asked this question because it's a little perhaps more surreptitious, or it's not as explicit as some other concepts that Deleuze brings out, like on jurisprudence. Um,
He has some interesting quotes about law. I read a quote from an interview, which he said, "If I hadn't been a philosopher, I would have been a lawyer."
yes.
Something along those lines. Anyway, so
Was that
he's
also in the G for gauche?
no,
Or
it's an interview. I'll have to track it down. That appeared in, I
it's not
think,
negotiations, is it?
no, I don't think so.
Okay, okay,
No, I'd have to look up the name of the interviewer.
okay.
I can track this down for you and send it to you. But there's the two places, G is in gauche, and then in this interview where he speaks about his interest in law, um, and particularly in jurisprudence. So that's where I follow them in ending up being interested in a lot in jurisprudence.
I
And I
do.
describe it as a
Yeah.
double, like I use the terms from Thousand Plateaus, double becoming, to explain what the, well, to explain, to maybe to shed some light on why jurisprudence is so interesting to Deleuze. Because if you have a state of affairs and you have an existing legal system, existing legal axiomatics, what happens in jurisprudence is that the state of affairs becomes a case at the same time that the legal structure becomes a ruling. And so the legal structure and the state of affairs are each moving in the other's direction in a double becoming, and that's setting a precedent. That's faire jurisprudence,
Hmm.
and it it's one of the reasons why the shift from anti-Oedipus, in which there is one axiomatics, capitalism,
Mhm.
to Thousand Plateaus, where there are at least three, economics, science, and law. That's one reason it's so interesting, because the law is susceptible to transformation in a way that Deleuze recognizes.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up this right off the bat because I do know I was looking for where in the written, because you're right to bring out when he talks about jurisprudence in G for Gauche, and it may be the where he tells the funny story about so he was interested in this law case going on in France at the time. So I suppose in the mid to late 80s, right, whenever those the Abecedere is being filmed, and he's following this case and he's interested because the whole crux of the case revolved around uh, someone pays to be transported by cab and smoking in the back of the cab, and the argument is that it's a violation of his rights as a cab fare rider to be disallowed to smoke
Right.
because the way that the vehicle, the cab, is the taxi cab is sort of at that point jurisprudentially defined is as a domicile, right? Like
Right.
so
Right.
he so he so that but Deleuze says, look at this case, and I'm sure the case law changed by the time that Deleuze is reflecting on this, but he's like the I think Deleuze says that himself. It's like but the way of conceiving this situation nowadays, he's saying, is the fact that that's not how the cab vehicle is described. It's not, you're not renting a house, a domicile. So those rules don't apply.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
and he takes that as a kind of something that fascinated him, and that for him exemplifies the reason why he says, like in negotiation, that where he says rights aren't created by codes and pronouncements but by jurisprudence, right? And I think for him this is why, again, too, he's very critical of something like universal human rights, because jurisprudence goes case by case and doesn't
Right.
proceed via these universal pronouncements that would
Right.
cover all
Yes.
cases.
Yes. Exactly. In fact, in the book on Leibniz, in the fold,
Hmm.
he has a discussion about precisely that, about how what he calls transcendental law,
Hmm.
or what they call in the Kafka book paranoiac law,
Okay.
subsumes cases under unchanging laws,
Interesting.
universal laws. And he says the Baroque way of thinking about this is not to is to discover or invent a new law for each case. So, as you
Hmm.
say, nothing universal, but
Yeah.
case by case. And this is, I think, why they prefer in What is Philosophy. Was it? I think that's in What is Philosophy. They talk about English law as being superior to French and German law. If I'm remembering
Ooh.
correctly, the location of that discussion.
I can look real quickly for that, because that is interesting. And I suppose the context would be that there's maybe in English law this more use of precedent, and let's see, English law. Yeah, that this is it on page 106. They use it as example 8, right? And they end by English law is a law of custom and convention, as the
Yes.
French is of contract, and the
Yes.
German of institution.
Right.
Um, so yeah, but I won't go too much into that. But yeah, it's interesting to distinguish those three.
So there are echoes of that in the fold, and also to some extent in the book on Kafka, where they where they talk about paranoid law and schizo law in
Mm,
terms drawn directly from Anti-Oedipus.
right.
Um,
Well, it is interesting because one of the most famous little Kafka pieces is Before the Law, right? You know, and
mhm. Oh
or
yeah,
the Penal Colony,
yep. The
etc. Right?
trial.
The trial. Well, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course,
So
I think of that one last. Or yeah, that's probably the most famous, right? In
well,
English was.
he was definitely obsessed with law, and it's an interesting evolution from the book on Mazoch, where he's interested in law as a philosophical problem.
Mm,
uh, Sade and Mazoch are responding to Kant's formal modernist conception of law, whereas in the Kafka book, although that's still at play, Kafka too is responding to
hmm
the Kantian conception of the law. He's also, on their reading, much more concerned about how law is evolving in Russia, in America, and so on, in actual historical circumstances.
I guess, Coop, I didn't want to preempt your question. I was wondering if you had anything else to add about this this point about about jurisprudence.
Not really. It's something that, just reading one of the essays came to mind, and I thought we'd just dig into it because it has come up a fair amount of times. I know you and I have discussed at
Hmm
length this case by case basis sort of idea of jurisprudence and so forth.
I mean, one of the key words for Deleuze in this is singularity, right? Like that, the case by case, and
Which would be
uh,
interesting that, Eugene mentioned some discussion of this in the Leibniz book, right? That's kind of interesting
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
in a sense.
And the other thing I would say is there's this interesting turn of phrase that Deleuze uses in the 60s, and I'm trying to think about the word for it. Casuistry. This is the
Oh,
word
okay.
that he uses, and it's such a strange term, I think, in our ears, but I think he literally means case by case. Uh, this is a case by case type of reasoning instead of something that is. So yes, normally casuistry is used in a pejorative sense, right? But I think that when Deleuze says it, for example, he says it in the
Oh,
Hume piece. It's the Hume piece. It's the one in Pure Eminence of Life. So it's the early Hume piece. Not maybe he says it in empiricism and subjectivity as well. But I think when Deleuze is talking about casuistry, he's thinking about this case by case application instead of something that would subsume everything under a
right,
kind of
right.
ill-fitting type thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess the pejorative sense is it's all ad hoc,
Yes.
but as you say, for Deleuze, that's its virtue. I mean, it
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
singularity, and it's treated as such. Yeah. Well, I think that his notion of the Baroque, although it's not a book I've written a lot on, but the Baroque is an approach that is bottom up rather than
hmm
top down, that is
hmm
case by case rather than universalizing. And that's its appeal. That's one of the appeals to Deleuze of it, or at least the way he defines the Baroque.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot. That makes a lot of sense. And I hadn't even connected this reflection on jurisprudence, which does seem to come out of left field later in life, but if it can be traced back already to even as early as his work in the 50s when he's really starting to publish stuff that he wants to be seen, not thinking of the stuff in the 40s that it is, like Portrait of a Woman and stuff like that he
Right.
didn't want published, but then it actually connects all the way through, and I shouldn't be as surprised. It's just he's sort of using a different language for it, and yeah, that's I think that makes a lot of sense, and it does make sense again about his, for example, and you point this out nicely, Eugene, right, where the categories of philosophy are, at least in the Deleuzean conception, isn't about truth with a capital T. It's about what's remarkable, what's important, what's significant, insofar as it pertains to problems and solutions. And I think that that gets to the heart of jurisprudence, right? Because concepts are always sort of called, the concepts are responding to problems, right?
Yes, yes. Mhm.
And so in that sense, for Deleuze and Guattari, it's not about these universal applications of concepts that are ready made. It's they're sort of in the making.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, there's a book by Laurent de Sutter called Deleuze's Philosophy of Law, and he ends up
Interesting.
arguing that Deleuze sees jurisprudence as the end of philosophy. That philosophy now has no. This is his view. I don't share it, but I don't think it's Deleuze's either. His view is that once you understand jurisprudence is the respect for the singularity of all cases, and that you operate without universals, without overarching principles, but instead invent or discover a principle for each case, then philosophy's job is done, and all you have is law.
That seems to turn that's like a hyper Kantian Deleuze in my mind, because
Yes.
it's about the philosopher becomes the conceptual persona of the legislator in the Kantian sense for the tribunal of reason. And I have to take a look at that, though. You said it's called The Philosophy of Law, or Deleuze
I think
and
it's
Law?
Deleuze's Philosophy of Law is the name
Deleuze's
of the
Philosophy
book,
of
I'm
Law.
pretty sure. And the last name is DE and then SUTTER.
Okay.
And it was published in one of the series by Edinburgh University Press.
Probably the Plateaus series, maybe. I mean, it's possible.
I think so. I think so. Yes, that sounds right to me.
Okay.
It's an extraordinarily comprehensive and thorough treatment of what Deleuze has to say about law and jurisprudence, but it doesn't make the move from philosophy to political philosophy that interests me.
Yes.
And so what I've done in my concluding essay is to do a section on the evolution of Deleuze's thinking about law, showing that he gets more and more interested in the outside, in what the law has to do with politics, economics, and so on, and doesn't remain a Kantian philosophical problem. But the book is definitely well worth looking at.
Now, this returns us, I think, a little bit to our first conversation we had, which we kind of specifically focused on that 13th plateau, where a lot of this discussion of axiomatics comes up. But I did want to ask you, because of your essay, and I may be getting the title wrong. Remind me, is it can axiomatics be revolutionary? Is that what was?
Yes, that's close enough. I think the title is what could possibly be revolutionary about axiomatics?
Thank you. And I guess I wanted to ask, because we talked about this in science. I mean, you mentioned in Anti-Oedipus, when they do refer to axiomatics in I believe it's the third chapter mainly, where they refer to capitalism as functioning by axiomatics and no longer by codes and overcoding.
Right.
I did want to get us into some of your essay about legal axiomatics. And I think you do bring this up in the other 2024 essay that I mentioned earlier about markets, the reforming the market. I wanted to ask you, do you believe the designation they have about royal science functioning by way of theorematics and minor science functioning by way of problematics, do you feel there's a similar type of interplay in legal axiomatics as well? Or do you think that really should be restricted to their understanding of science and we perhaps need different categories? Or do you think that's partly what we're talking about with jurisprudence, and what Deleuze is trying to say is more important about jurisprudence, that it might have that problematics status?
That's the way I would go. I mean, they use in the Kafka book, they use language from Anti-Oedipus, paranoiac law versus schizo law. By the time Deleuze gets to the book on Leibniz, it's transcendental law versus immanent law. But I think immanent law is jurisprudence. It's case by case. And when I argue for the axiomatic status of science and law, I think that's in the what could possibly be revolutionary about axiomatics essay. They both have problematics, and they both have models of realization for the axioms.
Right.
All three do, both all three, economic,
Yes.
legal, and scientific, all have this same tripartite structure. And so I would definitely say that jurisprudence is the nomad science version of law.
Would you, I guess, just to, because I'm trying to, I suppose, because you do lay out and sort of build the architecture of linking it to all other forms of law. We know it's a whole jungle out there to a certain extent. But
Yes.
what could you say? Would there be a word or a phrase that could sum up what the royal law or the major mode of law might be in opposition to this case by case jurisprudence?
Yes, there's an example in North American constitutional law. There's an approach called originalism.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't even think of the term, but yes, got it.
So this is the belief that the Constitution has written its legal axioms in stone, and
Yes.
you apply them, and you don't mess with them.
Yeah.
All the complaints about activist judges supposedly hung on the idea that you could look at the founding fathers' intentions,
Yes.
figure out what the law means, capital M, and apply it. So that's royal, or that's royal legislation. That's the royal or paranoiac transcendental view of law.
That's great. And it gets us into a kind of hermeneutics of the law that I think Deleuze and Guattari would oppose to, again, like a hermeneutics of the text, or even mere interpretation of the text, where the law merely needs to be interpreted instead of some sort of experimental aspect that would be what they would prefer, not just in literature, but it seems like that could apply just as much to the question of legal matters.
I think you're right. I mean, interpretation is the wedge that, or the, I don't know, the accommodation, the compromise that royal law might make to changing circumstances. Well, we can interpret this law differently. But I think you're right. The jurisprudence, the way Deleuze thinks about it, goes farther than that. And it works from the case upward, not from the law downward. And that's why interpreting the law, although it may be better than taking law as an absolute given for all time,
Right.
it's not where Deleuze wants to take jurisprudence, I think.
And I will say, just in case there are originalists listening to this podcast, I doubt there are many, but I think we would have to really nuance and concretize what Deleuze and Guattari would mean by experiment, because they obviously, originalists or those would want to say, well, that experimentation is just the arbitrary. And I don't think that what you're laying out in terms of case by case or building from the bottom up from the singularity is necessarily arbitrary. It may be contingent, but that's not the same thing, right?
Right. So this goes back to the ad hocism that some people complain about.
Yes.
And I think that well, I mean, if it's possible to draw the analogy between the science axioms and the legal axiomatic, they don't want to jettison royal science. They acknowledge that it has an important role to play, and in the same way, one wouldn't want to throw out the Constitution,
Right.
necessarily. But I think I still agree with you, but based on more or less on a hunch that they would want jurisprudence to go beyond merely interpreting the law.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know exactly how to phrase that. I guess that's what you're looking for in your question. But
well, I guess I suppose I meant that when I said experiment, it would sound out of context, like we're just going to we're just going to try things out willy nilly without any sort of things to guide us. And I think you're right to point out too that, just like with smooth and striated space, for example, it's not as though a smooth space is enough to save us, as they say, right? What it comes down to is the situation in which there's an interaction between the royal and the minor, like in science, or here, but in any case, I do think that the thing that they're worried about is the way in which, and this gets us to our discussion we had the first time you were on about denumerable and non sets, right? For them, the interplay, what they're worried about, and again, as you said, it's not just about sort of getting rid of royal science. It's about shifting our perspective and thinking that royal science is the only one with any sort of authority to enact. It appropriates the authority for itself and makes it seem like it's the only true mode of operating. Whereas what they want us to see, I think, is the way in which the non-denumerable gets translated into the denumerable. And by that, I mean, they don't just mean in terms of simple law. They're also thinking about minorities, even in the layperson sense, when they vie for recognition by the state. Well, that's just one way in which to become denumerable.
That's right.
But in to a certain extent, that is one way to ascend to a status within the majority, if not in the center, at least sort of within the purview of that notion they have about the way the standard works, the majoritarian works, and for them too, racism works is sort of, you have a center that radiates out these waves of sameness, as they kind of put it, and it depends on your degree of separation from that center, right? So even if minorities, not just in the layperson sense, but now too in the sense in which they think about non-denumerable sets, can be recognized, quote unquote, from that standard. That doesn't necessarily that I guess that really just kind of validates the position of the majoritarian rather than the other way around, rather than asserting the minor.
Well, that's a really tough nut right there, because on the one hand, they say, and I think they're right about this, that gaining recognition by the state is not necessarily a panacea.
Yeah.
And Wendy Brown, in her book called States of Injury, has some great discussions of the double-edged sword of having one's identity or rights recognized by a state.
Interesting.
On the other hand, they insist that the pressure of minorities must be brought to bear on the axiomatic. So how do you thread that needle? How do you get between those two positions? I think it's acknowledging the role that established law will continue to have, but nonetheless somehow give the upper hand to jurisprudential experimentation. And that's going against the grain of originalism. I mean, that's the that would be the gist of it.
This is partly why you emphasize that line on page 471. I was rereading it earlier this morning, that the question is about a new axiomatic. And you put a lot of emphasis on this. We talked about it a little bit the first time you were on, but I do think that even if your views have shifted from your work in 2011, which we mentioned, I believe it was 2011, right? We mentioned this before we started recording, but I think you haven't jettisoned this crucial reference that they make, and perhaps could have done more to substantify. But this notion of a new axiomatic that they gesture towards in the in what minorities bring to bear.
Well, it's a phrase I discovered, and it was sort of, it was I ran across it rereading the Plateau, and it's the only place, aside from their references, which are frequent, to a new Earth and a new people.
Yes.
It's the only time they characterize or even imagine an axiomatic that could be new. So for me, this was an impetus to really rethink a lot of what I had earlier taken there and my thought to be on these matters. And there's a in one of the last one of the 2024 essays, or maybe in both of them, I talk about what it might mean to reverse the priority of um, jurisprudence over existing law. It's like giving the molecular the upper hand over the molar, and so on.
No, this is. I mean, it's. I suppose. I guess what I think is interesting is one of the ways you frame it is that it's the question becomes is if some of the axioms by which, for example, you point to legal precedent, right, and you even point to legal scholars about how capital is sort of put on legalistic steroids in
Yes.
order to. I forget the theorist you're citing there, and we'll come back to it, I'm sure, and I could probably look it up. But this notion about how if certain axioms, almost like a Jenga puzzle, were removed or shifted enough that that could potentially cause the house of cards to fall, and
Yeah.
it reminds me a little bit, only a little bit, of something done with, for example, non-Euclidean perspectives, where there is this crucial piece, this postulate, this fifth postulate about parallel lines never meeting. And that holds up a whole closed universe that, once removed or lifted, allows for a totally different perspective that can then give rise to a certain view of the universe that can see um, a curved space, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So there's almost this interesting thing where it made me think about how there are, and which ones would have to be delineated and are open for discussion. But there are certain axioms that provide the crucial framework and bedrock for
Yes.
existing capitalism to continue thriving.
Yeah. And Deleuze and Guattari themselves talk about the number of axioms in distinguishing various social formations. I suggest that it's important to distinguish types of axioms precisely along the lines you were just saying, Taylor, because there are some legal axioms, like bankruptcy law and patent law are the most obvious, that grant clear privilege to capital over other market actors. And the the book you're referring to is The Code of Capital by Pistor, Pistor,
Okay.
where she shows that for centuries, capital has always ensured that it has steroids for its market behavior. And what I call enabling axioms are axioms that establish the groundwork for economic behavior. What can count as labor, right? Not
Right.
children, and so on and so forth. So these enabling axioms, both Pistor and Deleuze and Guattari themselves identify capital as a legal structure.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not all it is, but that's enough to enable me to imagine taking out the Jenga piece that is the axiom that gives capital priority over other agents, and shift it, for example, to production co-ops.
Yeah.
Give production co-ops a leg up on the market, or consumer cooperatives, or whatever. But that is in distinguishing among different types of axioms, I think, goes in the direction that A Thousand Plateaus takes us anyway, since it recognizes science and law as the axiomatics in their own right, distinguishing between the fundamental capitalist axiom, which is make more money than anyone else,
Right.
to speak very crudely,
Sure.
and then operational axioms, which I describe as determining the ratios of constant and variable capital, which technology get employed, and so forth and so on. And then the enabling axioms, which are the ones that shape the market in such a way that that capital always wins.
Yeah, I like the notion of enabling because when we talk about personal human relationships, when we enable others, it always sheds a light on our values, right?
Yes,
And
right.
what we're. In any case, I do think it's interesting that also highlights this notion of capital as a legal entity, and
Mhm.
not just the conjugation of abstract labor and flows of money. That as they define it in Anti-Oedipus,
Right.
gives it a much. I'm not going to say it. I guess it shifts perspective. It gives it a different concretization to allow us this. I mean that's potentially what that 13th plateau itself is made possible by shifting the emphasis from capital in its genesis or capitalism in its genesis its to the way in which it's sustained. And I think that's also
Mhm.
why a refrain, to use another Deleuze and Guattari term, but I think a theme in your work that we see coming out is this argument that modes of production are not what enable machinic processes, but it's the other way around. This is
Right.
another shift in A Thousand Plateau, where
Yes.
it's the modes of production that rely on machinic processes, or as they say, it's the state form that makes production a mode. Do you want to
Mhm.
speak a little bit about this refrain and how maybe it ties into our discussion?
Yes. Um, the shift from mode of production language in Anti-Oedipus to the machinic processes in the Thousand Plateaus is crucial because, in my view, um, it brings up the question of reproduction that Althusser had also addressed around the same
Right.
time. How does a mode of production reproduce itself? And Deleuze and Guattari insists that it 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 has to attain a certain consistency. They
Yes.
call it transconsistency, and that means that these machinic processes have to interact in a certain way or within a range of parameters for the mode of production to continue. And so, if you begin thinking about ways of changing these enabling axioms, it could shift. It could shift um, the interaction among machinic processes um, so that capitalism can't survive. So that's the argument for the renewed interest in consistency in their analysis of capitalism in the Thousand Plateaus. Now, the state making production of mode, I think, is more of a historical argument in this sense that um, a mode of production arises when the state commandeers labor power.
Right.
And they argue, I think, well, they argue that, and this is my phrasing for it, that surplus labor comes first, not
Yes.
labor, because surplus labor, that is, say, the labor power commandeered by the state, is what makes labor to begin with. Before, it was activity that was woven into the fabric of social life by codes, and that is why the state makes production a mode.
Interesting.
And then to bring it into the closer to the present or into the present, the state still functions to try to guarantee the consistency of a mode of production, the capitalist mode of production of whatever variant we're talking about, whatever model of realization, the states function. And this is why Althusser called all the ideological state apparatuses, although I think he's wrong, is because he saw that the state's main function was not to expend surplus the way it was under despotism, but to arrange, to axiomatize social life in such a way that capitalism can continue to make a profit, basically. So those are the ways that I think some of the reasons that the shift to this different way of thinking about modes of production and so on is so fruitful when they explain it in A Thousand Plateaus, and then of course it continues on into what is philosophy and the Controlled Societies essay and so on.
No, this is helpful because one of the things that I think, and this is not included in your collection, but it refers back to your reader's guide of Anti-Oedipus, and I just wanted to harken back to it only because one of the concepts I remember reading in Anti-Oedipus that I feel that they maybe take as a given or don't shed as much light on because they have other things to do, I suppose. But that you bring out very clearly in your reader's guide is the notion of anti-production.
Yes. Yeah,
And
I thought that's where you're going. Yeah.
And I only wanted to bring that up. I know this is treading ground that we've covered in the first, but it's sometimes good to repeat and go over. I wanted to bring that up because if I recall correctly, at least in Anti-Oedipus, and I would have to reread A Thousand Plateaus to see if I don't even know if that they use that language anymore, but they at least in the capitalist formation they seem to articulate that anti-production becomes more or less part and parcel of one of the state's activities,
Yes.
and one of the things that they point to is, for example, military expenditure.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you think, and again, I might Control F and look at my version of A Thousand Plateaus to see if they even use the term anti-production. But do you want to maybe say a few words about that concept?
Yeah, this was one of the. I think you're right. They more or less take it for granted. I made sense of it in my initial reading of Anti-Oedipus by thinking of Bataille's notion of expenditure.
Mhm.
And Bataille gets his notion from Nietzsche. They get their notion of anti-production, I think, arguably from Nietzsche.
Mhm.
And so, and parenthetically, even if it appears somewhere in A Thousand Plateaus, it certainly doesn't play the role that it did in Anti-Oedipus. I mean,
I did check. It doesn't seem like it's the word is
yeah,
used.
doesn't surprise me. Doesn't surprise me. But they do mention, as you say, militarism as one of the state's roles in assuring the consistency of capitalism, because there's a gross overproduction of things that has to be absorbed.
Mhm.
And as I said in someplace not included in this collection, bombs are the perfect commodity for that, because you blow them up and then you have to make more.
Yeah.
So now militarism isn't the only thing they mention, but one of the tasks of the state is precisely to manage ant production, to continually refuel it, so that the wheels of industry can keep turning, and so crises of overproduction can be avoided or forestalled anyway.
Right.
Um, and so the New Deal is one of the things that Bataille, well, the Marshall Plan is actually what he talked about, but
Mhm.
they're similar in ways. It's a vast expenditure injected more or less at the bottom of society to keep the wheels of industry turning. That's a different non-militaristic way, although most historians and economic historians think that it's really World War II and not the New Deal that solved the Great Depression. Nonetheless, there are different, and Bataille makes this clear too. There are different ways of the state managing the expenditure of surplus, managing anti-production. Fourth of July fireworks are fun.
Military parades, right?
Right. The nuclear arms race is less fun, and that's what the one that Bataille picks on. It's a question of and the state would presumably still have a hand in managing anti-production post-capitalism, but it wouldn't be just to make profit. It would be for other reasons. Joy.
Right. I mean, that gets us that full circle to this notion of expenditure at all in Bataille and this non-utility of it too, at the heart of but it seems highly utilitarian, so to speak, under capital, at least for capital's sake.
Yes, that's right. It's functionalized by capital, and when you mentioned my reader's guide, I suggested there that Freud is contextualized by Marx in schizoanalysis, but Marx is contextualized by Nietzsche. And one of the ways is that they understand modes of production to be organized. They should be called modes of anti-production, basically.
Right.
Everything is organized around debt and paying debt. And that's the Nietzschean element.
Rendering the debt infinite. And you referenced the National Bank in England in the 1690s. And sort of that becoming the model for how capital subsumes this infinite debt owed to the despot and takes it up and recharges it through the market.
Yep.
Yeah. The other thing I could think of, this is just off topic, we don't have to discuss it, but it does throw a new light, this discussion of anti-production vis-a-vis the state does shed some light on movements or the recent Department of Government efficiency and the fact that it's shown to be actually kind of the opposite, or at least it probably will still turn out to be the opposite of actually providing any quote unquote efficiency. But I think itself, this notion of extirpating fraud and waste in government seems to be not heavy-handed, but just seems to actually get things backwards, right? The way following our discussion, it does seem like that's what states are. If we take waste in the Bataillean sense, that's what states are doing in the first place. They're managing waste and non-efficiency, but in ways that sort of shift the perspective, I think.
Yes, they do. No, that's true. I was struck by a passage that I ran across in writing the conclusion to this collection, where they talk about exerting the minorities exerting pressure on the axiomatic.
Yes.
They say there are three reasons to do this. The third reason is to create a new axiomatic. We've already talked about that.
Right.
They mentioned that 7 pages later, but it still counts, I think, as the third option. The second option is to prevent the technocratic perversion of axioms. And for me, the best example is green capitalism, so-called. You have a reasonable goal, but your means of pursuing it are completely perverted by capital. Obviously, the first thing though is to prevent the totalitarian reduction in axioms. And they've spoken earlier or later about the number of axioms being crucial in distinguishing various state forms. And the totalitarian has fewer axioms. The liberal democratic has the most, or more anyway.
Right.
And the whole axing of departments in the government and so on strikes me very much as a move towards totalitarianism in the way Trump is proceeding.
At,
Um,
at least in the at least in the way that it is not done either bipartisan or nonpartisanly, or with some sort of strategic goal in mind. Right. You're not bringing a scalpel. You're bringing as Elon Musk showed very
yes,
figuratively and demonstratively, you're bringing a chainsaw.
yes, right.
And I think that that's a good point to bring to bear uh, to help. I had forgotten that, obviously, but that is a good point. I think Elon Musk he retweeted, and I don't want to talk about him too much more. I'm sorry, but he retweeted, as he's wont to do, a meme that you know on the left side, a giant sort of book, supposedly 100,000 pages long, and it said like our existing law, and then a book that you could hold between your thumb and your finger, like
Mhm.
law as it should be. And that, I think, kind of shows that that's, if we take law to stand for axiom, which I think more or less, since we've proven, or since they argue that there is a legalistic axiomatic,
Mhm.
then yeah, I do think that this that there's something to it, and it's not just about the fact that reducing law is always totalitarian, but there's a tendency towards a minimum that is what they seem to imply, right?
Right, right. It's not that, I mean, not that any given law can't be eliminated, but the tendency, as you say, to a sparse set of axioms is
Hmm.
how they characterize totalitarianism. And unchecked power, I mean, it seems to make intuitive sense, even though they don't develop it a great deal. I think it does make sense. But you're also right in saying that the kind of waste and fraud the that Musk was after um, is not the kind of expenditure we want to encourage the state to undertake. Here, Bataille, I think, is very clear. We don't want nuclear armaments. We want something that people can enjoy collectively.
Right.
Um, and that's not Medicare fraud. It's not $17,000 toilets or whatever example you want to give from the Pentagon budget. That's got to go. That can go. But
Well, that's the ironic thing. Since my lifetime, and Coop, you can back me up on this, and I'm sure Eugene. Uh, but it became apparent to me as I came of age, around, obviously, post 9/11, the Bush years. But almost every year or a few years, you would hear how the accounting for the Pentagon or the military budget was always off by magnitudes. This unaccounted expenditure. And it is interesting that the military budget is not obviously going. I mean, it's even under Biden increase. So I'm not letting Democrats off the hook either here. But not that matters. But it's the chainsaw didn't fall upon military budgets and expenditures, even though, again, as we said, that's one of the most blatant. I think it's why Deleuze and Guattari take it as a prime example of state anti-production.
yeah,
Uh, and so, it is. I suppose the other thing I would say is just that this question of, like, as you said, this goes to your distinction between puissance and pouvoir, which I believe we've talked about. We've talked about it with Michael Hart when we were
hmm,
discussing Spinoza, but I do
yep,
think that your way of phrasing it as power with versus power over, it does seem like all of the waste and fraud is only to be found in power with, and those things that might provide a social safety net and joy and different types of well-being for
hmm,
the populace. That gets cut because it's easy to demonize the sort of, so to speak, parasites
yes,
or illegal immigrants or whatever it is
yep,
that's just
hmm,
supposedly the source of that waste and fraud, instead of, as I was saying, the sort of conceptually different but specific waste that states are always sort of going to be in league with because of their role with anti-production.
Yeah. Well, yeah. One of the sentences I added to the draft of my conclusion focused on paranoia
Hmm.
and how the power, the capitalist power over the market, spreads precarity.
Yeah.
And precarity produces paranoia, which I define in this one sentence as seeing the other as a source of fear instead of as an opportunity to share enjoyment and enhanced capacities.
Mm-hmm.
So shared joy and enhanced capacities is power with. That's what markets can do. And the imposition of precarity and paranoia, and therefore the distrust of immigrants and other things you mentioned, that is one of the things that the new conceptual constellation of A Thousand Plateaus and Control Society essay enables us to see about what had been well, not strictly, but had been more psychological terms in Anti-Oedipus. Paranoia is now not a psychological, but a sociological phenomenon. And I think that's very valuable.
Coop, this reminds me of how much you reference amygdala and enhance I think that Coop is the studies. I'm not sure if you've seen this, Eugene, and we can give it with a grain of salt, although there's probably some truth to it. But enlarged amygdalas in the brain lead to a heightened sense of fear and distrust, and of course this would re-psychologize or neurologize what you were just saying. But I do think that there is a sense in which this can be more of a collective phenomenon, as though the collective brain had swollen an amygdala based on its values. In any case, I only say that because there is a sense, I suppose, just to shift it a little bit. We talked about the legal and the and somewhat of the economic. I do think that one aspect of the legal and the scientific and their intersection is the fact that I do believe, and there's a lot of pushback, obviously, from donors and all of this, but I do think that there has to be some circumscription of what artificial intelligence can and should be allowed to do under. I still think it's a part of a wild west, at the moment, and the question of the legal axiomatics or the jurisprudential treatment of the possibility of artificial intelligence in the future is something that needs to be dealt with, unless we are to have a Butlerian jihad, right, Coop? Where are you familiar with Dune, by the way, Gene? Have we bombarded you with Dune references in the past?
Wouldn't be hard to overwhelm Dune references for me.
Yeah. Okay. But I do think that that's one thing, because we mentioned it before the show started. But the question of what AI, ChatGPT, these other types, the question of that being a case by case basis, because I do think that there is a sense in which artificial intelligence, and this is again optimistic, could potentially be used in manners to promote collective joy, power with, but I don't think it's going to do it on its own. I don't think the corporations that are benefiting from it or pushing that technology are going to self-regulate. I think that type of line, again, we keep hearing about sort of letting markets, or those who are monopolizing markets self-regulate, I just don't think that type of axiomatic is going to play out in anyone's benefit.
I agree entirely. And the repost to that is social movements, which social movement war machines, which pressure legislators to adopt regulations for the for the betterment of humankind.
Yeah.
And for safety. But even though that's where I end up in the evolution of my thinking, exerting pressure on the axiomatic requires social movement war machines.
Mm-hmm.
But AI is moving so fast, and it is technically so complex that it's hard to see a social movement that would have enough grasp of what the issues are to pressure legislators who themselves are largely ignorant of what the issues are.
Right.
So that's I sort of scratch my head when it comes to AI. It's so powerful and so unpredictable that I just, as I said, I just scratch my head. I don't know what. But I did note that that it appears that the Trump administration is using it to write its medical reports.
Well,
And
yeah.
the report has just invented studies.
I was, just to respond to that, I didn't cut you off, but I was thinking, it reminds me though, when, for example, when you look at say like a bad translation, and it's a question of, would a machine churning out a translation have made the same mistakes? And I wonder, I know that AI can quote unquote hallucinate, if that's a technical term, can hallucinate facts or perhaps sources, but you do have to wonder if there wasn't a human hand, at least if it was initially ChatGPT or AI generated, if there wasn't a human hand curating those false sources. Because I only say that because I do feel like while certain mistakes by machine translation, to use my initial example, can be predicted, one of the things that I think it does is on larger sentences or larger batches of text, it will drop out keywords so that's its type of hallucination, is a kind of oblivion. So I wonder about actually fabricating the sources. And that, to me, again, I know that so much of it can be relegated to incompetence, but one has to wonder if some of that isn't purposeful and malevolent, and maybe not just AI hallucination, but potentially the hand of, again, I'm thinking of the old way of dealing with plagiarism. Today, it's a new deal, right? With the fact that so many students are relying on ChatGPT to write their papers. But in the old way of plagiarizing, yeah, I mean, you can imagine students perhaps fabricating sources, and it feels more like that. But again, that's just an assumption. I see more human malevolence than AI hallucination, but I obviously can't say anything definitive on that.
Right. Well, you're absolutely right that they have an axe to grind with this medical report. So there's definitely motive, human incentive to do that. Whereas for the AI, it wouldn't be malevolence; it would just be hallucination, which they don't attribute motive to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess that would be even so, even if there is a kind of lying or malevolence by omission, by not having any sort of, if it were, which makes sense, if the report were AI generated, to have no oversight by any sort of human agency to double check those sources and put some kind of then it goes back to a kind of incompetence, to not but it seems too beneficial but on the other hand, a lot of the sources too have been shown to pretty much argue diametrically opposite of what the report is stating.
Yeah.
So that weighs the scale back on incompetence and not malevolence, because again, you would think those would have been cold. So it's a kind of, I think it really just is another example of the kind of base chaos that this administration, we already saw it in the first iteration of it, but it's ramped up. It's
Yeah.
and it's a means of attempting to, I think, paralyze collective action. The as they as Deleuze and Guattari say in one's philosophy, chaos is not sort of the absence of determination, but the infinite speed at which determinations take form and disappear. Right.
Right.
So there's that kind of uncertainty, which isn't just relegated to the market and the stock market, but to, as you mentioned, there has to be some sort of collective action. For example, with what to do with AI, how to circumscribe it responsibly and in a way that can be for human flourishing and not merely for profit. That threading that needle is itself difficult, and that's why I brought up the Butlerian jihad, right? Of sort of almost outright banning sort of all calculating machines. But if we get to that point, we've obviously gotten to a point where capitalism itself has been modified substantially to have lost out in making that decision.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know I threw a lot there at you. Coop, do we want to look at maybe one or two points in the in your draft before, because I know we're getting close and I've monopolized the time. I'm sorry. We're getting in the we're past the 1.5 hour mark, so I do want to leave some room while we have Eugene here.
Yeah, we could talk a little bit about I guess some of the market slope things, because I think one of the I mean, Eugene, you don't necessarily spell this out directly, but I think maybe there's an implication that history itself becomes a problem with respect to private property. And I guess even like what is it, the initiatory violence of the state or the founding violence of the state that sort of gets repressed, because how are you supposed to have a free market whenever there's history and there's like property's already been claimed and so forth, and like that being such a problem, right? Because it's like capital doesn't just yield the present day, you know, whatever power over due to the surplus value it produces like on a daily basis. It's leveraging the history of humanity itself, like all the labor that's ever existed, whether performed by humans or even the earth, in a sense. Like that's what gets leveraged over us, and that's what makes it so difficult for social movements to overcome the inertia of already the primitive accumulation issue.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So that I guess sort of circles back in a way towards the question of jurisprudence, or even just right and property rights. I'm thinking about, just to maybe like crystallize an example, I'm thinking about in the Game of Thrones universe, how they have this family that builds it's like I guess technically it would be like a bridge, effectively, across a major waterway that bifurcates the country, right? So that due to their, I guess, the primacy of them arriving at that particular location, investing in building that bridge, then they can simply, become rent seekers in perpetuity, effectively, just by right of first arrival. Which, how do we so that becoming the real problem is like, how do we dislodge these pre-existing pools of capital that are almost on their own? You know what I mean? Companies outlive humans by quite, by
Yes.
hundreds of years or, theoretically forever. So,
yeah. I saw was it a T-shirt that said on one side, slavery is the illusion that people are property. And on the other side, it says corporations are the illusion that property is people, which is a nice way of getting at least some perspective on the problem.
right. Yeah.
So corporations obviously are one of the accumulated power and wealth of corporations is definitely a huge problem, and the historical, the long-term historical buildup of this. But think about two or three things which are going in the opposite direction, are kind of countercurrent. One is what New Zealand has done with respect to rights of the Maori people. So that is trying to address an historical wrong via jurisprudence, or at least via changing the legal structure. Paul Patton has written about Australia trying to do something similar, but I think New Zealand is the better case. Another instance would be I mentioned this in one of my essays. The rights that have been recently granted by Panama and the United Kingdom, among other countries, to nature or to life. Now, this is a step in a direction where one can imagine property rights being subordinated to something else. And this is, the EPA has done this in this country, has said, well, you can't just pollute this waterway. That's now illegal. So you have to internalize that externality. And that had a marked impact on corporations' bottom line. So my feeling is that there is this huge historical concentration of wealth, which has only gotten orders of magnitude worse in the last decade, let's say. But that there are paths open. Well, the other example is the progressive era in this country at the turn of the last century, when the robber barons had accumulated vast amounts of power, and the anti-monopoly legislation was passed, and there was some headway made. So there are ways of addressing this as a legal problem, but that still begs the question of how are you going to get social movement war machines to pressure the legislature, which has been largely bought off by those same corporations, to make these changes. But the EPA arose in our lifetime, at least in my lifetime. So
under Nixon, no less, right?
Yes, that's right. It was Nixon. That's right.
Good Lord. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, that's surprising, but that's true.
Stranger things have happened.
Yes.
Taylor, you were mentioning AI, and I think to me that goes back to the same, like maybe it brings in a sharp relief to this issue of dead labor, in the sense of what the AI is doing is it's right. It's aggregating all of the same thing. It's like reterritorializing the already.
It's capturing maybe even
the apparatus of capture of the labor of all labor that's already been performed, and it can do things. So it's like, it has the advantage by not only the like historical accumulation, but also by the fact that it's not limited by the needs that biological machines have, and it can cross borders without restriction. It can move at the speed of light, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like this leverage against labor is just like astronomical, right? And, one wonders.
And I will say, Coop, just to build off of what you said and take it in a slightly different direction, this gets us back to Deleuze's interviews and the Abecedere, when he says, the Cartesian problematic is one that's focused on error, and it's an external event that can happen to the intelligence, right? With Kant, it shifts into the real problem that can befall thought. It's not problem. The real danger, risk that can befall thought is illusion, and now it's internal to reason. The interesting thing about AI, what you're talking about in this mass cultivation, aggregation, capture, reterritorialization of dead labor and including intellectual labor and artistic labor is now, and I said the word earlier to Eugene, but it's a technical term used in AI, is hallucination, right? And it's built in, it's baked into what AI is doing. And it doesn't seem to be just because it's not being able to filter out what is good and bad content. I think that may be part of it, but one wonders if that aggregation accrues to itself this hallucination that is I'm not so sure it can be eliminated, at least within the feedback process internally. It might have to be something merely cold case by case. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, apparently it's getting worse with the new reasoning AIs. Their rates of hallucination go up to close to 80%.
Really?
These are the AIs that think, that actually reveal how they arrived at a conclusion. And that sounds great. Everyone's wanted more transparency, no more black box. But unfortunately, the result so far has been hallucination on a greater scale than before, than when it was a black box. So, yeah.
And this is, go ahead.
Just one thing about the data sets that have been captured by AI. This is, in some respects, dead labor, certainly, but it's also, in some respects, the commons.
Yes, that's right.
This is the way Michael Hart and Tony Negri talk about these issues. So this is commons, and if it could be, again, it's sort of like a Bataille riff. There could be a good aggregation of common knowledge, but it all depends on the problematics by which the AI is put to work. And right now, of course, it's largely profit driven. Even OpenAI is going in that direction. So you have a bad capture, but there's also the possibility that the commons could be put to other uses in a different context.
Yeah, I think there's the Chinese is it DeepSeek? I forget the name of the actual, but
DeepSeek.
They have an open source code for theirs rather than proprietary like most of the others.
Which is so strange coming from a authoritarian context, but yeah, that's right.
Very interesting.
These are all good points, and I like where, again, I think that this question about the fact, Eugene, and I think I may have seen something similar. I didn't know the 80% stat, which is a bit frightening, but the fact that hallucination is the new danger to, let's call it, general thought, right? Generalized AI thought, that's the new specter haunting thinking, if we can call it thinking, but provisionally we'll call it that, or at least it's the aggregation of quote unquote thinking, dead thinking, or something, to use like Coop's language and Marxian language. I just think about, I just wonder, if that is the new paradigm. What is interesting is that it runs the gamut. It traverses the two poles of paranoia and schizophrenia, because paranoia can just as much be subject in delirium to hallucinations as schizophrenia can, right? I mean, in terms of psychosis as a general, to use those terms, and so it almost it gets us, obviously, and they already moved beyond that binary, as you pointed out, Eugene, in A Thousand Plateaus, but it does sort of call into question, or at least, it's not as though, well, I suppose, if maybe that's the thing. I wonder here, the way I'm trying to formulate this is, for Deleuze and Guattari, and I think they bring this up explicitly, I don't think they see that capitalism in its axiomatic can be saturated. And I mean that in the sense in which that's used, for example, in mathematical axiomatics, right? That there can be a saturation of an axiomatics as though there can't be another one added on. And for them, I think that this is part of the movement of de and reterritorialization of capital, where it's constantly approaching its real limit, but pushing it back, right? I wonder, though, if there is a saturation effect going on with AI as it continues to quote unquote improve, at least in terms of the energy behind its thinking processes. It's continuing to hallucinate more and more, as though there were this counter tendency. And whether or not saturation is a good word for it, it's probably not, because I'm kind of using it outside of the axiomatic framework. But
right. Well, I just point out that the 80% was an up to range. It was the top of the range of
okay, I see.
experiments with so-called thinking AI,
and that makes more sense. Yeah.
But it was, I think, from 16 to 79 or something was the range. But everyone noticed that it was greater than the old model, which was the black box where you didn't know what was going on inside the AI.
Almost as though observation, the partial observers, it's we've collapsed the wave, and we've kind of quantumly fucked things up. But that's interesting. I guess, I suppose the reason why I brought that up, and even brought up saturation at all, wasn't actually to apply it to AI. That was heavy-handed. I was thinking, it doesn't seem like Deleuze and Guattari, and I bring this up for a reason. I'm going to make this point. We talked about removing some key axioms, like I used the Jenga metaphor,
right?
To make capital collapse, or at least stumble and falter in a way that could bring it to its ruin.
Right.
It doesn't seem like the opposite can be true, that capitalism can be saturated with axioms. And the reason why I bring this up is because there are times around the point of Anti-Oedipus, and Guattari in the single writings kind of says it too. It's as though the accelerationist bent, and I'm not saying that Deleuze and Guattari themselves are merely accelerationists, although they have that aspect in Anti-Oedipus. It seems as though there are some indications from them that if we just keep putting more and more shit out there, right? Like Guattari's like more gadgets, more thingamabobs, and as though we can make capitalism tumble by doing more and more. And I don't think this works on the axiomatic level with their examination, specifically in 1,000 Plateaus. But I wondered if the way I've even framed this makes any sense to you, Eugene. Do you understand kind of what I mean by it seems as though there's maybe a hope in the 70s that there can be a way to, like, if we could push it over, if we just add more shit onto it.
Right. Well, a few slogans aside, I've never understood where accelerationism is supposed to get us.
Okay. Yeah.
And it seems really to fly in the face of Guattari's recognition of the climate crisis. I mean, the three ecologies were partly.
I think that's why he dropped that language later in life. I think he went from more and more shit, as though we could be schizophrenized that way, to we need to shift from a scientific paradigm to a ethico-aesthetic paradigm that pushes us towards, as you said, acknowledging the climate impact that humans are having, specifically through capitalism.
But there's the other thing. The question of saturation is slightly different from the question of overproduction.
Yes,
I think that their view is that axioms can be added. Well, operational axioms can be added and subtracted any time.
Okay.
And so, and as you say, since one of the aims of restructuring an economic sector is to push the limit that old capital poses. It suggests that repeated view of a limit being set and then being pushed farther and then pushed farther again suggests that saturation is not a phase changing operation for them.
Right.
It's just a temporary feeling until something else comes along to accumulate capital in some other sector.
It's the rate of the tendency of the rate of the profit to fall, and is counteracted
Yes.
at the same time, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And you write about that specifically in those later essays, and yeah, it's interesting just to think about. I guess that's the thing. That's why it's the other way it's interesting is for them to make multiplicities rhizomes. It's not n+1 as though, or the Hegel's bad infinite of just adding ones together, right? Like I was saying, but it's subtraction. It's
right.
n minus.
Yeah.
So that's why key axioms, right? Again, it's because we could take it to the totalitarian type that you said, but perhaps subtracting key enabling axioms could shift it to a new axiomatic, and what that might look like. That third prospect that you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Well, Coop, do you want to bring up one other thing, or should we give Eugene the platform to plug the collection coming out in The Last Word?
Man, I did like that. I did think it was interesting how you brought up this notion of separation anxiety and
Yes.
that impact on the repetition compulsion and how that subsumes the pleasure principle. I don't know if you'd want to discuss that a little bit. I thought this was, I mean, I assume the Fort Da game is kind of rolled up into this with maybe some reference to the kind of masochism and sadism of, I guess, the repetition of kind of like hurt it. The child throws the toy to make it go away, and then how it's the anxiety. I think that's maybe the relationship, or is that the source material that you're drawing from for this a
Well,
little bit?
there's a great essay, by the way, on Fort Da by Greg Seaworth. I wish I could remember where it was, but it's the best comparative reading of that little Hans, or no, it's the Fort Da thing. I don't think it's Hans.
It's his grandson.
It's his grandson. That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
By Freud and by Deleuze and Guattari. But no, the repetition compulsion thing comes from beyond the pleasure principle. It's one of the problems that Freud is wrestling with. And for me, what's important about separation anxiety is that for schizoanalysis, it's the capitalist market that fosters separation anxiety. So for Freud, it's that if you're an infant, you can't survive without parental caregiving. And so there's anxiety about separating from your source of life. But for Deleuze and Guattari, it's the market that separates us from our lives. And you have to have a job to be able to buy back what you've produced or what someone else has produced. And so in my extension, well, it's just a rephrasing of the schizoanalytic perspective. It's the deferred action, Nachtraglichkeit, or après coup in French, which explains how capital magnifies, aggravates separation anxiety, no matter what one's childhood was like. And separation anxiety, in turn, magnifies the repetition compulsion. The more anxious you are, the more likely you are to repeat whatever source of pleasure or gratification you had before. You get locked into a neurosis where you don't develop any new means of satisfying drives. And so for me, the notion of separation anxiety, the aggravation of the repetition compulsion, is is very important in its own right for the degree to which capitalism sponsors neurosis by making everyone precarious. There's an institutional version of this, which I address in my essay on the Anthropocene, where institutions wind up not pursuing the goals they were founded for, but simply protecting themselves, ensuring their own longevity. And that's another offshoot of it. But in the context of my perversions book, the aggravation of the repetition compulsion leads directly to the psychodynamics of sadism and masochism. And so, even though these are, in my view, in the schizoanalytic view, events that occur in the history of the development of the capitalist mode of production, nonetheless, they are drawing on psychodynamics that are characteristic of the human animal. We are dependent as children, and so on. We do get neurotic. We do limit our modes of gratification. We could expand them, and so on. But that's sort of, if you will, the not exactly the remnant, but a kernel of analysis from Anti-Oedipus that remains very important to the diagnoses that are possible with the schizoanalytic perspective, diagnoses of what capital does to markets. And for me, that one of the reasons that schizoanalysis, and this is something I came to rather late in my thinking, one of the reasons that schizoanalysis is so important is that it adds to Freud's analysis of family dynamics and to Lacan's analysis of linguistic dynamics. It adds something proper to market dynamics, which are a very different animal and had not really been factored in to psychoanalysis or to psychology until Anti-Oedipus.
I don't know if we have time to necessarily delve into this, but this made me think of like maybe even kind of what Baudrillard gets at in symbolic exchange and death, and like the repression of death in society, and like I don't know, and I think the kind of precarity that gets introduced by the market, like there's a weird duality in the sense of death is repressed, and that sort of like that in a way that's part of enabling the repetitive cycle of accumulation, because like I don't know, maybe the unconscious being sort of immortal, so to speak, or something like that. And on the other side, it's like the kind of like going back to Hegel and the bondsman, it's kind of like parceling out the little death on the installment plan. That's kind of how I've always phrased it, about you're trading these little bits of death, which would be really your life, like your biopower, your abstract labor power, your labor power, etc. You're doling that out on like a sort of installment plan to keep yourself alive. So you're kind of in this double bind of being death is repressed, but it's also on the other side, you're kind of, so it's like the motivating factor in the sense of the precarity, right? Like my lack of property, my lack of being able to sustain myself drives me to produce surplus value. But then also there's a sort of weird aspect where there becomes a repression of death to where there's almost immortality. And I'm more concerned with, I don't know, maybe more concerned with the future, or investing my future and foregoing my enjoyment now. Yes. I'm saying you're kind of like, you're trading, it's this kind of dialectic between creditors and debitors, maybe even at a more macro scale. So.
Well, I was not with you until the creditors and debtors, but definitely the repression of death makes people latch onto whatever modes of gratification they can glean from the market, and the death on the installment plan is I think a great image for that, because every commodity you purchase is a way of forestalling death.
Right. Yeah. I think debt by debtors and creditors, I mean in the sense of consumption versus perhaps investment, right? Because there's like a time preference relative to satisfaction. Like I'm gonna spend
Yes,
this dollar in my pocket today rather than invest it for the promise of $2 tomorrow, for example.
right,
And that
right.
maybe that polarity and being caught in between that, sort of trying to negotiate via the market where I am on that
Yes,
spectrum,
that makes
perhaps.
perfect sense because the more anxious one is, the less likely and more fearful for one's life, the less likely one is to just expend what you have, and you're more concerned about saving it up like a squirrel or
Right.
investing it in further, like in career development or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, you can see this at really like kind of in the stock market recently, at least with all the volatility, right? That sort of triggers the sell-off mentality, the fear
hmm,
triggers the the kind of hoarding of wealth, et cetera, versus being willing to invest and so forth. But I didn't really have anything else beyond that.
Well, I do think that this is why something like the hoarding phenomenon, in the old days, you would just call it being a miser, although that was usually just in terms of the way in which you store money. But hoarding as a psychological phenomenon is not just about maybe uh, cutting oneself off from others, but also about this anxiety and how to even if the things that you're storing up aren't necessarily usable, there is a sense almost egoistically of having what you need
yeah,
right
hmm,
there, even if you're buried by it. So
yeah.
it's a different type of slow death. But yeah, I mean, Coop, I brought up I brought up this question of the miser maybe a month ago, and I probably didn't articulate it well, but it does remind me of there's a scene in 12 Monkeys where Brad Pitt's character is sort of, he gets to have some of these monologues where he's he's uh he's sort of disquisitioning about what current society finds to be insane, right? So one of the examples he gives, like back in the turn of the century, it was Semmelweis trying to point out that these little tiny microbes and germs were
Hmm.
existing, and that was insane. But it's now insane to say hold on to your money and not put it into circulation or put it into the banks. You're a bad consumer, and therefore you need to be institutionalized, et cetera. Of course, he's exaggerating a little bit, but not by too far, right? And I think this points to some of Eugene's analysis here about not just separation anxiety, but it seems like there's a way in which Brad Pitt's character is turning it around as though the markets are like I like when Bush's tax cuts and sending people money. It's not about putting it into your savings account. Put it back into the economy in
Right.
order to circulate and boost the economy. So it seems, Eugene, there could be a kind of like in the way that Deleuze and Guattari say Oedipus begins in the head of the father. Maybe there's a little bit of separation anxiety from on behalf of those who are custodians of the market and not just consumers.
Well, I do think there's what I call somewhere return on investment anxiety,
Okay.
which is the other side of the market, where you have to continually perform other capitalists, or else you get acquired or go bankrupt.
Hmm. Yeah. No, that is a good point. Yeah, and that's why the stonks have to go up, right?
Yes.
The
Yep.
quarter, the every quarter, and yeah, I know. All right, Eugene. So I do want to give you the forum here for the outro to maybe say a little bit about this collection, which we spent talking about, whether you have a title for it, perhaps you've got a publisher, and if not, maybe just tell us a little bit about what at least we can expect to be forthcoming. You have the floor. Tell us about your forthcoming work.
Thank you. I think what I said about it was before we recorded, so
Yes.
we'll start at the beginning. So I'm publishing a collection of essays. I think that I think I found a publisher, but I have to submit the whole package to them first. But it's going to be in something of a intellectual autobiography. I start with an account of what it was like to be a Deleuze and Guattari scholar from the 80s on. And then I have collected essays and divided it into three categories, three sections. The first section is among the oldest of the essays that are included. It's called Tools, and it just explains how Deleuze and Guattari draw on Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche to develop schizoanalysis and nomadology. So this is the sort of tool chest that then informs the second section, which is called Diagnoses. The first section shows that philosophical concepts have two functions for Deleuze and Guattari. One is diagnostic, and the other is prospective. So the second section is all about diagnoses. What diagnoses does schizoanalysis enable us to make about capitalism? And there are essays on Baudelaire and on Sartre and on another French novelist, Paul Nizan, and an essay examining how Deleuze and Guattari's thinking about fascism changed between Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plateaus. Then the third section is called Prospects, and this is the other function of concepts, which is to identify tendencies that offer the prospect of beneficial change. And these essays talk about schizophrenia in their sense, and talk about jazz improvisation as an instance of schizophrenia in their sense of the term, which then serves as a model for imagining what schizophrenic markets would look like. How would markets function freed from capital? And then I end up then talking in the prospects section 3 about the changes that are made in Thousand Plateaus to their conception of capitalism. And it ends up suggesting that capitalism is not as stable as mode of production thinking suggests it is, and that there's a need for consistency among a variety of machinic processes, including science and law. And therefore, the last two essays of the third section and the conclusion argue for legal axiomatics as a path for freeing the market from capital and enabling the market to do what it can do best, which is to enhance our capacities for enjoyment. So that's the outline of the book. Each of the sections has its own introduction, but there is a general introduction and a general conclusion. And it's been a very interesting project to look back at where the tools came from, what diagnoses they enabled, and then how the changing prospects for addressing capitalist markets and transforming them, what they are.
And I will add, Eugene, the last time we had you on, it hadn't yet been published, but I did want to let the readers know that last year you did, even though we talked about it, because you gave us a forward copy, but you did publish Perversions of the Market on Sadism, Masochism, and the Culture of Capitalism. And that's a book that readers or listeners can check out while they wait for the collection of essays, and they might be able to see aspects of some of what we talked about, specifically Coop's last some of his last questions on separation anxiety and Sod and Masok and all of that. So they can, while they're waiting, they can go check that book out.
Yes, definitely. It's available. It's from SUNY Press, and it's out there. And I do address in that book the role of separation anxiety and the impact of capitalism on that through the market.
Well, Eugene, I appreciate you coming on and it's timely because you had something to promote. But we would have talked to you at any time, whether or not I reached out to a friend. I won't name them. I won't call them out, but they're working on publishing something, and they've delayed again, and are saying like, well, I know that it's probably not appropriate to come on the show unless I have something to promote. And I was thinking, that's just a benefit for the interlocutor, for the guest, to be able to two birds, one stone, because it's really about fostering a sort of an environment where these kind of ideas can be discussed. That's the most important thing. And if
Yes, that's
if
the
there's
fun of it.
that's the fun of it. And
Yeah.
I tried to let them know, like, hey, you don't have, not everything has to be perfect. And to a certain extent, it's kind of nice to, like, we had you on the second time, to be talking as the ideas are still being formed and not yet congealed. And then, you might have moved on to something else. Right. So there is obviously benefits of both. If the book's already out, you can promote it. But if it's still in the making, there's something exciting going on. So I do encourage, future guests. I do encourage you, come on whenever. And Eugene, we welcome you back. Maybe when you've gotten the book sort of in the production process, we can have you again sooner than later, maybe at the
Let's
end
hope,
of the
yes.
year.
That'd be fine.
But I appreciated your willingness to answer our questions and to talk with us and to go over some of this work with you, and for sharing the essays, some of which I had read, some of which we hadn't seen, some of which are from this past year, so they're new. And again, I thank you for spending your time with us, obviously on this Sunday afternoon.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you guys, as always. And I will confess that this interview was what got me to finish the draft of that essay. So
Oh,
Nice.
thank you very much.
put a little bit of pressure on you
Yeah.
to well,
Some anxiety.
yeah, a little. I will say, I think in our schedule, and Coop, you can. It'll be probably either next week or the week after that.
Oh, for this episode, we'll be out today, actually, or tomorrow.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that's
Well,
where we're at now.
Coop's
All right.
Coop's motivated. We've gone through our backlog.
Yeah,
You were
exactly.
you were on deck,
Oh,
Eugene.
great.
So
Great.
I'll email you sometime tomorrow where you can find it and listen back. But we appreciate you again, and we'll let you go. We're gonna stay on for just a minute or two, but Eugene, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, guys.
All
Thanks
right,
again,
have a-
Eugene. And that'll wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with
The
Cooper
very
Cherry and
rules
Stuart.
are easy of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, pure violence without option. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.